Well, welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to the 2021 Alaska SAF Annual Meeting. The virtual traverse of Alaskan forestry will continue today as we travel north through Alaska. My name is Ed Morgan. I'm chair of Alaska SAF, and I will give you a brief recap of yesterday while people are still joining. We were very fortunate to have our CEO, Terry Baker, yesterday, and he covered a lot of topics, partnerships, collaboration, how we were doing business during the pandemic, talked about his new office space in DC, with a little description of the big slab of wood behind his desk. And they've been updating national position statements, hiring a lot of staff, filling positions, which is really great, and working on increasing membership. And I think a real plus for yesterday was having lots of time for questions and answers with Terry. A lot of good discussion. We also had Pat Hewer talking about, he gave a great overview of the Sitka area and a description and the history of forestry and logging in the area. Dr. Alan Brackley gave us a really interesting story about the Dawn Redwood in Sitka, and a lot of it was, he described the contradictory at times history of how and when the redwoods were brought to Southeast Alaska. But moving on to today, I will turn the meeting over to our host for today, Brian Kleinhens. He is the current chair of the Juneau chapter. So Brian, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ed, and thanks everybody for joining us today in beautiful Juneau, Alaska, on our traverse across the Alaska chapters of the Society of American Foresters. So for those of you from out of state or haven't had the chance to visit Juneau, we're the capital city of Alaska, located in the panhandle of Alaska in the temperate rainforest. And one of our claims to fame is that we have one of the most easily accessible saltwater, or sea level glaciers in the world. And I'll have share my screen here just to show the image of our beautiful glacier. So this is pretty neat. You can actually take a virtual hike to the glacier with Google Maps. And this is what the glacier looks like on a beautiful, nice day. I don't know, is everybody able to see that? Thumbs up. So I like this Google map because if I clicked over here, I got an instant vision of what Juneau looked like on a normal day, which is overcast and gray a little bit. But you could see that we have a very steep terrain. We have timbered hillsides and beautiful water, and some kind of weird half ghost person there looks like on Google Maps. But I encourage you to use some of these tools and come visit us virtually. Juneau had its start as a city, not as a timber community, but as a mining community. So at one time, Juneau had 3 of the world's largest gold mines. And right out of the hillsides, right here behind downtown Juneau, over 2 tons of gold was extracted. So in today's dollars, that's over $9 billion worth of gold came out of these hillsides. And the reason that the mine stopped running actively here downtown was a combination of catastrophic mine flooding, and World War II stole the workforce. So after World War II was over, the mines never started again. Here in downtown, we have 2 remote mines near Juneau that are still extracting gold and silver and employing a substantial chunk of the population. All the mining in Juneau was hard rock gold mining, so we're digging tunnels down through the mountains. There's more miles of tunnels underneath Juneau than there are miles of roads in Juneau. Just an interesting fact. And we like to say here in Juneau that the roads are paved in gold because most of the roads were built using fill from those mining tunnels. And given the extraction technology of today versus the extraction technology of the late 40s, there's still a substantial amount of recoverable gold right there in the gold in the bed of our roads and the fill underneath our communities. And in terms of the forestry industry, most of the early timber industry in Juneau was in support of the mining operations. So timbers were cut to build the supports for the mine tunnels. There was a plywood mill that ran out near the airport that produced plywood and other materials. My house is built with hemlock that came right off the hillside above town here. When the mining industry faded, so did that local boutique timber industry. But as the hub of Alaskan politics and being the capital city, a lot of agencies and corporations have maintained their headquarters here in Juneau. And so Juneau's chapter of SAF has long included many of us that have worked for those agencies. Forest Service has several offices here. The BIA has offices here. So we've always had an active chapter. We're a wonderful place to live. I'll put in a final plug now that we've all realized that remote work is a possibility. If you hate traffic jams and hate crowds, but you love being outside and fishing and hiking and enjoying nature, Juneau's a pretty awesome place. We got gigabit internet service and cell phone coverage, and you got to come here and be our neighbors. It's a wonderful place to be. Happy to welcome all of you, both from across Alaska and across the country with SAF. We've got two really exciting speakers for you today. I'd like to start by introducing my friend, Dr. Dave Demore, who's a soil research scientist at the Pacific Northwest Research Station here in Juneau. His research program focuses on soils and watershed biochemistry and landscape function and change. Dave's part of the landscape productivity team. He's an expert in Southeast Alaska ecological systems. He's done a lot of critical and extremely interesting work with Alaska yellow cedar, its ecology and physiology. He regularly comes to join us and share findings at the Juneau chapter, and he's changed the way I've thought about a lot of silviculture practice in Southeast Alaska. He's always interesting to listen to, and we're very lucky to have him here today. And thank you for that, Dave, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great, just a quick sound check. You hear me okay?
Yes, we do.
All right, great. Let me share my screen here and get that going. Hopefully you see my presentation.
We got it.
There we go. How's that? Okay. All right. Hopefully it's in presenting mode. Yeah. Thank you, Brian, very much for that introduction. Really glad to be here. It's always exciting to talk about some of the, renew some of the past things that we've worked on, as well as introduce some new concepts into this. And so today I'm going to focus on some of the things we've learned and some of the things we're discovering about soil plant interactions, especially in the realm of soils, specifically that I work in. Just to frame this, our work is focused on the coastal rainforest system, the extended outer coastal Pacific forests, ranging from California all the way up to Prince William Sound. Today, I'm going to be focusing on that green area, the perhumid or wet, non-fire prone part of the system, but some of what we'll talk about actually pertains to the seasonal rainforest, Oregon and Washington area. So first, we have to take a step back. When you look at the landscape here, it's incredible how much biomass we have covering things, and the extreme variation in elevation and ecosystems. But it's really important to remember that, this was covered under, miles of ice, right? Not too long ago in terms of geologic time, right? About 10 to 14, 15,000 years ago, the ice was peeling back and we were just starting to form what we see today. You kind of get a glimpse of that when you're flying into Juneau. Like Brian said, it's a spectacular place. And if you fly in on a clear day to the east, you can look and see the extensive ice field where we have present day glaciers. But you can also look to the west and see, exposed land that's evolving. So forming soils that support the vast and diverse ecosystems, including our signature large stature conifers and our peatlands. So what I try to do is I'm a landscape forensic pedologist, as one might say, right? So I try to understand how we went from this kind of landscape in the past to what we have today, and what that might mean for present day vegetation and ecological process chemistries. So this is a picture of a reseeding glacier in the ice field, back in the ice field, actually taken from what's called Camp 18, which is one of the Juneau Icefield Research Program sites. And what you can see is very distinct parent material, we call it, in soils, where down below where the glacier is pretty much flat down in the lower part of the valley, it's pressing the materials down, forming compact tills. Then you see the till deposits at ablation till at the lower part of the hill slope, and then exposed rock actually in a lot of the areas on the back slopes. So again, really diverse, modes of formation, and all these materials will end up forming, the basis for our soil development in the region. Well, another way to look at this is you can go from the present day sort of unvegetated hill, peaks, all the way down to our vegetated valleys. And we have very different ecosystems, but a lot of it is determined on how much water you get and where that water flows. So, you can also look at it in this lateral view. You go from in a catena from upland forests through our forested wetland areas, our shrub wetlands, and then down to our emergent wetlands or our blanket bog and extensive peat areas. This is another just classic picture, right? You get these, stringers of forest on the better drain sites in between these open emergent peatlands with lots of water. So again, this is kind of the mosaic that we have for the vegetation on the landscape. So we ask a lot of questions about this. It's like, well, what does this mean, right? For, in my realm, biogeochemistry, the movement of nutrients and materials, both within the system, within the vegetation and beyond, into the streams and the coastal waters. I'm not going to talk too much about the coastal waters today, but that's a whole other story. I wanted to focus for this group on the vegetation and what we're learning. So we sort of we can partition this landscape. We can look at how things are happening. We get a lot of distinctive features that are still mysteries to us, like these little ponds in our sloping fens. How are they forming? What's going on? Not going to answer that today, but that's something that we're wondering about. Why does vegetation occur in some places and it doesn't in others? In soils, its traditional view is to really look at that. I showed you that parent material that's formed, and how soils form through this tension of this continued uplift of the material and then the erosion off of the top. So a lot of times we're just looking at the physical factors, and traditionally soils have only looked at like this physical evolution. But what a new and emerging and important part of this is actually looking at how the vegetation, the trees, especially plant roots, and the interaction with the soils are affecting this whole story. So the first thing I want to just point out is we've been able to partition the landscape with some simple metrics. And where does vegetation occur? Where does like above ground biomass sort of divide and between, high accumulation and low accumulation, right? Where's our division of our wetlands? And through some earlier research, we found that it was pretty clear that if water gets above 30 centimeters, in the water table. And this figure on the upper left where that red line is, that's the depth to water from the soil surface, soil surface being 0. So you get below about 25, 30 centimeters, and that occurs on our very, distinct slope break. So you go from a wetland to a non-wetland pretty fast. If you look at the figure on the lower right here, you can see that distinction. Now we have depth to water on the x-axis and the biomass accumulation. So above ground biomass accumulating. You can see a distinct break there again. And again, that biomass accumulation corresponds much like the hill slope position, the biomass. Now this is what my good friend and colleague, departed friend John Coette used to call modeling the duh, right? We can all see this, we all know this, but it's important that we sort of quantify this when we look at not only how this is affecting present day processes, but how we're going to model it into the future. So here's a 4-part figure showing now some of these ecosystems, U representing an upland, PFO representing our palustrum forested, PSS our shrub scrub, PM the emergent. So these are the 4 national wetland inventory classes which we use to array across that hydrologic gradient or that biomass gradient. And as you can see, these vary a lot in terms of some of these distinctive factors. The upper left, the depth, the days that water is in the rooting zone, very distinct differences there. Available light, even in these areas, a lot more light coming into those open areas, right? In terms of vegetative growth. pH, a controlling factor in the lower left there panel. In a lot of biogeochemical processes in the soils, really distinctively different in these systems. And again, overstory biomass. So we can describe a lot of key factors, that are going on just by looking at these ecosystem types and understanding where water is and where it isn't. Another thing we can do is we can evaluate flow of water based on these ecosystem types, which is related a lot to it's not only the vegetation type, but its slope. And what this is showing is, again, 0 on the left axis here, the y-axis being the soil surface, -10, 20, 30, that's centimeters below the surface. And these black lines represent when you generate flow in these ecosystems. So how much water is coming off of these. So as you can see, the uplands sort of generate flow, up and down that spectrum of water table position because you get water flowing through them. Forested wetlands have very distinctive flow paths, but all focused near the surface. So we have this kind of, and this is going to be important when I talk about some things later, those forested wetlands, you can imagine that 0 to 20, 25 centimeters, that's where water is flowing. That's also the available space in that soil that's drained, so plants can root there. That's the whole key of how we keep forests in wetlands in this region. Because, and if you go to the emergent fens, those open peatlands, they don't have very much, a very deep drained surface. So you don't see, woody biomass accumulating in those fens. And this is one of the key reasons why. It's that aerobic or that drainable surface. So another thing we see is within these systems, this is showing, again, water table depth on the left. And now I don't have 0, but that -0.1, that's near surface. -0.45, that's, the depth below the surface. And that black line you're seeing there, that's the variation in this water table as you go through the season. The red line is what's called redox potential. That is just an indicator of the electron transfers. So it's an indicator of the biogeochemical kind of signal within the soil. And one thing I want you to notice is when that water table drops down, again, creates an aerobic surface where there's rooting, again, available rooting depth, more favorable for turnover of nutrients, you get a very dynamic exchange of electrons. Those electrons are doing work. They're actually breaking down organic matter. They're releasing nutrients. So again, you're creating a much more productive kind of system. And again, this is kind of the key to how can plants survive in a very, very wet environment, right? So again, just focusing in on this area, you can see that kind of inverse relationship between water tables drop, you get much more activity in the electrons there. So going into the future, one thing we do have here, and I like to highlight, is though we are a rainforest, it's very wet, we have a drought period. This was pretty evident a couple of years ago when we had extreme drought. From May through about July, we actually, even over a 30-year normal period, we get a moisture deficit. We can have water tables dropping down and staying there, and right in the early part of the growing season. So again, what are the implications for plant roots? What are the implications for the ebb and flow of woody vegetation at the expense of emergent vegetation? It's a key question as we move into much more diverse sort of climate regimes. So again, back to water tables, we see the deep water tables in the uplands, the intermediate in the forested wetlands and our sloping bogs. And again, that drawdown period where you get that extended rooting depth for plants during the growing season, even in our wet environments. So what does this mean in the future if we start seeing those systems start getting deeper and deeper with these drying periods? Well, we may have these characteristic water table shift downward in the profile, creating more surface rooting depth, more biogeochemical transformations. So one thing that I'm trying to do is quantify what this means to the carbon cycle. This is a depth profile picture of one of our emergent peatlands, and that is all organic matter down to 1 meter deep. So huge, accumulations of organic matter driven mostly by the decomposition of plants, plant rooting, growth, and death, and accumulation, and not decomposing within that profile. So I've looked a lot at wetlands, but what I want to highlight here is we're now looking at our uplands. And one of the changing paradigms in soil science and carbon cycle science is looking at the soil, the carbon accumulation with depth. And one of the culprits in leading to this vast, array of carbon that we see at depth in these upland profiles, this is the well-drained end member, are plant roots. We've really underestimated how much the root exudates and the interaction with the microbial communities contribute to the accumulation of soil carbon. So, and that is a really intense kind of focus of research, because not only are we trying to determine how much carbon is accumulated there, but also kind of challenging our existing paradigm that soil carbon, we don't really need to worry about it because it's very stable. We're really recognizing soil carbon is metastable, right? It's actually dynamically turning over, but you're adding as much as you're taking away through erosion and through decomposition. So, but what happens if that balance changes? And a lot of that has to do with the delivery by plant roots. So another thing that affects is not only carbon, those plant roots and those interactions with microbial communities actually interact with nitrogen, another key element. And here's a recent study I did with my colleague Sarah Bisbing. The upper graph shows you the really clear relationship between the total amount of inorganic nitrogen that you find in a soil and actually how much nitrogen is mineralized. Now you need to mineralize nitrogen for plants to use it. We tend to have very low mineralization rates or even immobilization in our systems because of the conflict or the fight for nitrogen with the microbial communities for plants. They're getting enough, but a lot of times, again, we're very nitrogen limited, barely enough. And you can see that relationship there. With ammonium, the middle block there, what was really intriguing is, again, you get the amount of water in the rooting zone, again, is controlling those ecosystems. But if I want you to notice those two triangles that stick out in the B box in the upper right, those are the forested wetlands. Now, those forested wetlands have lots of water, but they also hold huge amounts of nitrate, of ammonium, in their organic matter. Again, a real key to the productivity. How do you maintain woody biomass? How do you turn over nutrients? There's a ton there. It's just not readily available a lot of times. But you have to really, we're paying attention to those forested wetlands because we're recognizing they have a lot more organic matter and available nutrients than we might have assumed in the past. We're also looking at this through a microbial way. Liz Kreitinger is a grad student I have at Cornell. And these are all the genes which are coded on the left there, that dotted line in the middle. The aerobic respiration group, that means the carbon turnover. So primarily where you are turning over carbon. And it looks like that A1 gene, which is primarily responsible for carbon turnover, oxidation of carbon, very distinctive between, again, our upland communities in the brown, the forested wetland and upland, and our wet communities. So we're seeing distinct differences in who's doing the work, the gene communities. But on the other hand, the N-oxide reductase group, the nitrogen reducers, they were kind of equivocal in our findings. They seem to be operating everywhere and operating, the same. So that has big implications for your balance between carbon and nitrogen in these soils. And again, may explain why we see a lot more nitrogen accumulating and being turned over, across the whole ecosystem. Another thing I wanted to introduce is, I brought this up earlier, what are we trying to do? We're trying to understand plants and plant roots, and we're trying to understand them at lots of different scales. My colleague here in the upper right pictured Dr. Rebecca Librand is an expert in using what we call these mesh bag bait. They're little bags of crushed up rock that we bury in the soil and leave and incubate, as it were, over a few years, and then pull them out and then analyze them for how much the material decomposed or was weathered, and weathered in association with plant roots. That figure you see, the dark gray figure in the middle there, that BS represents a basalt grain at you can see like a 40 micron scale. So micrometers here, tiny particles of rock. Those HYP, those tendrils you see, that's fungal hypha. That's, that's a living material that's interacting, and you can see where it's attached to those rocks and actively secreting enzymes to help weather the rock. So, and again, on the right, you see some etch pits. ECH means an etch pit. That's where that rock, there's been a whole mineral part plucked out of it primarily by that BFM, which is basically a root material. So again, evidence that the plants are doing work on our weathering. Remember that picture I showed of that glacier, right? The post-glacial sequence with that sediment. Right away, you get this happening, post-glacial. You get plants establishing, you get mosses, and they're going to work on weathering these rocks. And it continues even in our older forests. So finally, I just want to revisit my old friends, the Cedars, and reprise kind of some ideas that we had when we were working on yellow cedar decline. Now remember, yellow cedar occurs in the forested wetlands. I've talked a little bit about the dynamics of forested wetlands. And one of the key things about, yellow cedar that we were concerned about was, as yellow cedar declines and is not regenerating, what's replacing it? Will these become non-forest? Will they become open peatland, right? Because of the loss of that above ground biomass. So one thing just to review again, the cedars are really, really interesting because they have this interesting interaction biochemically with the soil. And this is an idea that we published in 2009 with the mechanisms where cedars actually use they're calciphiles, so they accumulate a lot of calcium. They drop that calcium and it actually leads to the potential for them to take up nitrogen in the form of a nitrate. And this would be consistent with a lot of that. There's a ton of nitrogen there, but it's hard to get at in these forested wetlands. One way to get at it is your shallow rooted and you can drive the nitrification in the soils, and you can take up that nitrate as a nitrogen source. So again, this just portrays it. I think if you've walked around these woods, you can see this in the middle picture. Tremendous, litter fall on the ground. And you can imagine if your tree roots are shallow, you can accumulate that material. It really is a pretty effective nutrient acquisition strategy. Only one problem. If your roots are that close to the surface, you're also susceptible to the ultimate Achilles heel of the yellow cedar, the thaw-freeze cycle, the freezing of your fine roots, the death and the loss of the ability to transpire and take up nutrients. So again, that was a story we've worked out a few years ago with my colleagues, Paul Hennon, Paul Schauberg, Gary Hawley, many others. But and this is one of the key parts of it. Why would you get your roots so near the surface that they were susceptible to being killed, right? Well, this is one of the reasons. So one of the things I've done though, in doing this work, I came up with this kind of simple model of like, here's like this, what we call these niches for our main species here across the hydrologic gradient, right? So where you get, the water table, low, you get your Sitka spruce, your western hemlock, you get your, a more, let's call it vigorous forest. Where you get the water table closer to the surface, we end up with our cedars and the shore pines, right? Well, also in those environments to the left, those well-drained environments, you tend to mineralize and have ammonium more readily available. In the wetter areas, you have nitrate available. So again, this is a simple model of showing, how we can partition the landscape into these niches. And I want you to note how closely associated yellow cedar and red cedar are. Again, this is just showing that mechanism where if you have exchangeable calcium, a lot of exchangeable calcium, you actually don't have a lot of phosphorus. The phosphorus gets kind of locked up. So that's one interesting trick. We didn't really deal with phosphorus, but it's clear that the cedars may be actually dealing with a phosphorus deficiency as well. But where you have a lot of calcium, you can get a lot of exchangeable nitrogen in exchange for that calcium. So one thing I want to highlight in this whole story is one thing we wondered about is that the red cedars were very closely associated with yellow cedars in a lot of their physiology and a lot of the mechanisms. This is a picture from near El Capitan Cave where these red cedars are actually growing right into that calcareous bedrock. It was incredible. But again, the red cedar has that same kind of physiological mechanism where it accumulates a lot of calcium, has a lot of calcium in its foliage. We believe it engages in that same nitrogen cycle. So one of the models for forest succession then that we thought was, well, as these yellow cedars are dying, the red cedars can occupy that space because they have the same growth habit. They can come in and occupy that space and probably keep that forest as forest in forested wetlands. What we've seen recently, and some of you may be familiar with this though, is there are more and more outbreaks of what's being noted as red cedar decline now, especially down in Washington, southern British Columbia. And this is going beyond what red cedar does in terms of its top kill. Red cedars have a habit where they'll kill their top and grow a new leader, right? You see those spiked forks in the top of red cedars. Well, one thing when we were doing our cold tolerance work, we noted that red cedar, this here in the middle, its cold tolerance was much more closely associated with yellow cedar than it was with the other conifer species. So we always wondered, we also noted that it was probably a little deeper rooted and was protected from these thaw-freeze cycles and the drought, cycles. But we're beginning to speculate whether a lot of the extensive red cedar dying we're seeing may be related to some similar mechanisms to yellow cedar. And we need to consider that. But it does have some pretty significant implications moving into the future, for the future of red cedar now, especially as in the northern latitudes as we get more dramatic climate fluctuations. So that was it. Some some of the old, some of the new. Hopefully, I've left you with some new thoughts about our forests and how they interact with our soils. There's a never-ending amount of questions that we have about those kind of things, and so it's always great. So anyway, I don't know if you want to do questions now. Let me check. I will stop sharing and check the chat. I see a few chat comments, it looks like. Okay.
Yeah, we have a few minutes for questions, if anyone has any for Dave. Okay. So actually, Dave, Brian has one. So climate models say we will get warmer and wetter in Southeast Alaska. How will that impact our forests?
So first, let's put an asterisk on that warmer and wetter. The climate models are pretty certain about us getting warmer. The temperature increases are well constrained. The models look good. They're agreeing with what we see. The precipitation models are not very good for the coastal rainforest, mostly because we don't have weather stations at elevation. We don't have a lot of weather stations. We're modeling with not a lot of data, so they're not fitting very well. So plus the wetter may be wetter seasonally, and it's appearing that a lot of our moisture may be coming in winter storms. But again, what we're concerned about is that that drought period, that early growth season, right? And if that becomes droughty, and you can imagine with warmer temperatures, trees are going to attempt to transpire more. They're going to actually extract any excess moisture that we have. And if we don't have a lot of snowpack, we're not going to have a lot of stored soil moisture. So I'd say those are kind of our inflection points, you know, that the overall modeling of the moisture, we know it's getting hotter. That's going to drive increased transpiration. That's going to drive increased evaporation. Our snowpack may be lower. And again, what's that early part of the growing season? I think those are the key implications and, you know, kind of things that we need to be concerned about in the forest.
All right, great question. So we got another one. If red cedar is also declining, what do you project will replace the yellow cedar forests?
Yeah, you know, not being a plant physiologist, a plant expert, but knowing a little bit, I would speculate that, you know, hemlock tends to be a weed, right? Hemlock it can go just about everywhere. It's not going to be real vigorous, and we often see it in those. So I would assume that hemlock, you know, Warren Oak's project showed that the hemlock is probably going to be able to occupy some of the space. So I would say, but, you know, will it be able, you know, the hemlock tends to not grow as vigorously as the yellow cedars do in those forested wetland environments. The cedars really, they do well in that niche. They don't want to be there. As we know, they can grow huge if you give them a chance in a well-drained environment, but they do exploit that wet forest niche well. So I think the trade-off is going to be maybe volume, vigor, you know, of the trees in those environments.
Okay, all right, we got another root question. So you mentioned root exudates, sorry if I mispronounced that, and the role on soil, sea, and nutrient cycles. Can you explain more of what their role is?
Sure. The root exudates, and I apologize for that, great question, thank you. A root exudate is actually like candy sugar to the microbes. It is the very labile, highly nutrient enriched sloughing of the outer coating of the roots or the root tips dying and then before they extend. So it's a very nutrient rich labile material which microbes can exploit for metabolism very easily. And basically decompose it. And part of that, the incomplete decomposition products are organic acids and organic matter, which then gets absorbed to the soil particles and is retained through complexes, mineral organic complexes within the soil with iron and aluminum. So that's kind of the process. The microbes use part of it, but part of it is retained. And then even the microbial biomass when the microbes die, same cycle. So the more you expand that process, you're burning off a lot of it as CO2 through respiration, but a portion of it is retained in the soil as solid carbon associated with the mineral soil.
Oh, fascinating. Great. All right, looks like one last question we got. So Chris asked, is it reasonable to think that lower water tables associated with climate change will mean current bogs will become more forested over time?
How long has this debate? We can go back to the 40s, the Chandlers, and then the 60s, right? I mean, we've been debating this for decades, and I don't have a good answer for that. I do, though, have a new perspective, and my concern is not as much if the trees are going to come into those environments, but if the organic carbon and the carbon stored in those open peatlands is going to decompose, and we're going to lose a huge amount of that surface carbon. So, and that could be a negative feedback because, again, if you make that surface aerobic, yeah, plants could get the roots in there, they could start growing. But if you erode that aerobic surface and it's this tension between you're eroding it faster, the plants get in there, and then you're saturating up again, drying out, it's kind of a race, I think. So I think I'm a little more concerned about the decomposition. But certainly, we might see plants encroaching on those. I think there's some really cool tools now that we can use with repeat photography. I think that's being employed in some areas where we have enough historical photography. I think we're getting pretty rapid changes in our systems. So we could kind of look at that at that bog forest interface, see if we can see some changes.
Cool. All right. Well, we have time for one more question? Does anyone have one last one before we turn it over to Brian? No. Okay. I think I got all of them. Okay. All right. Well, Dave, thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today. And again, if people have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'll turn it over to Brian next.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Dave. Fascinating talk. And as always, I learned a lot by listening to you. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm sure everybody else is appreciative at hearing about some interesting research questions, and just appreciate the way that you're able to explain it in really common terms. So thank you so much. As a second presentation today, we're very excited to host Ariana Lapke, who lives in the neighboring community of Juneau. And Ariana is a youth engagement coordinator for the Tlingit tribal government located in Juneau, and that's the Juneau Indian Association. So that's the village's tribal government. Ariana leads the summer youth employment program, training rural Alaskan youth leaders and students. We call that TRAILS for short. TRAILS is a paid opportunity for teens and young adults to learn about natural resource management and monitoring, as well as develop their leadership skills. She also does work in the school and is currently coordinating a fisheries technology college course offered by the University of Alaska Southeast with campuses over here in Juneau. She's involved with high school students learning about fisheries management and related careers. Our focus on increasing interest in natural resource management and membership in the Society of American Foresters, as well as looking to increase the diversity of people that get involved in natural resources careers, made Ariana a natural choice to join us today. And we're very pleased to have her perspective. So please, Ariana, go ahead and share your screen, and we're looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. Great. There you go. Can you guys see my screen? Awesome.
Gotcha.
Perfect, thank you. Well, like Brian said, my name is Ariana, and I work for the Hoonah Indian Association, which is the Tlingit tribal government here in Hoonah. And I'm going to talk about engaging Southeast Alaska youth in our natural resource management here. So I figured I'd give you guys a brief introduction about myself first. I grew up in Washington, which I joke is like Alaska's little sibling, right? Just less bears and more people. And I got my Bachelor's of Arts in Environmental Policy from Western Washington University in 2018. And then after I worked for a little bit, I moved up to Hoonah as an AmeriCorps Vista, actually, for the tribe, the environmental department specifically, where I still work. And with my position as a Vista, I was building capacity by coordinating a traditional food fair. And then I did a lot of work in the school, like creating lessons and working around science opportunities in the science classroom. And that prepared me really well for my youth engagement coordinating position after my Vista term ended in April of 2020. So I got to know the students a bit better and kind of understand the needs of the youth in the community. And so Trails, as my youth engagement coordinator position, was really focused on this program, the Training Rural Alaskan Youth Leaders and Students program. And so Trails is a paid summer youth program in hands-on natural resource management and field work. It's generally about 10 weeks long, and we hire about 3 to 6 students around 15 to 25 years of age for 10 weeks. And the Trails program actually occurs in multiple communities. Hoonah is just one of them. It also occurs in Angoon, Prince of Wales, and Cake. And so each community's program looks a little bit different because each community has different needs. There are different resources available, different partners and different projects going on, and as well as like funding and time availability as well. But the Trails program is a part of the Alaskan Youth Stewards Program, or AYS. And AYS is basically just a diverse partnership of tribal governments, corporations, nonprofits, community engagement organizations, and other passionate individuals. And we're all just focused on getting youth engaged in natural resource management and getting them on the pathway to fields, careers, and higher education in those fields. And we do so by blending experiential education, on the job training, and career counseling for youth. And so a lot of this are just interdisciplinary perspectives of natural resource management through different projects and partners to get them more interested in these different fields. So in Hoonah last year was my first year coordinating the program. The Hoonah's had Trails since 2018, and each time it's been hosted by HIA Environmental, the department of the tribe that I work for. And I was looking through our projects, and they seem to kind of fall into 4 different categories, but there was a lot of overlap. And I figured today I would just jump into one project in particular of each of these 4 different categories. But so for cultural stewardship, we did a lot of harvesting and processing of traditional foods, participated in form line drawing. We interviewed locals, like local artisans on carving and weaving. And then we also assisted with Culture Camp, which is a local program that we have here every summer. Also, our work focuses on community service. So the traditional foods that we harvested and processed, we distributed throughout the community. We maintained recreation sites that people like to go to, developed the community garden, and utilized our mobile greenhouse that we have for a couple years. We also do a lot of environmental restoration work, right? Hence the environmental department. So we do a lot of invasive plant species removal, trash cleanups, trail maintenance, and we helped the Forest Service remove an ineffective fish ladder last year. And then lastly, the bulk of our work is around data collection for natural resource monitoring and research. And so we, thankfully, from all of our different partners, we're able to do a lot of this work. Here internally with HIA, we have shellfish biomass surveys assessing populations of clams and cockles. We do geomorphology surveys, which is looking at the studying how rivers are changing after we've done restoration work on them in the past. We collect stream temperature data to monitor our streams for salmon habitat, collecting water samples and doing paralytic shellfish poisoning, doing snowpack monitoring, which is similarly to what we were talking about before, which is looking at how the water is affecting, or how snow is affecting our city's drinking water up on our mountains nearby. And we also do salmon fry trapping and identification with the Forest Service, snorkeling surveys, and tree coring for dendrochronology research. So jumping into the cultural stewardship aspect, one of our biggest projects was the Wood Products for Culture and Heritage project. And our primary partner with that was Adelaide or Die Johnson with the North Pacific Research Station at the United States Forest Service. And our primary goal was to assess the values of wood products for cultural practices to better manage timber and sustain native culture. By wood products, I'm specifically referring to spruce roots and cedar bark, as well as the timber itself, and cultural practices includes carving and weaving. And so a little bit of background about this project. The United States Forest Service is one of their mission aspects of their mission is to sustain wood for cultural and heritage practices. And as we know, human and climate impacts are altering the availability of these wood products for cultural uses. And so we are engaging in citizen science to learn and share about what we found out. We also wanted to provide youth with interview experience and develop their interpersonal skills and get them more experience in data collection and reconnect them with themselves, their culture, and their community members. So to do so, we led qualitative interview discussions with artisans. The kind of questions we asked were, what educational, health, financial, cultural, or other values and significance do wood products provide to you and your family? How easy or difficult is it to access wood products for cultural activities? Do you use them for cultural activities, or how much of which wood products? And what are some ways that the Forest Service can help communities access these wood products? So I supervised the crew members as they got to choose who they wanted to interview. They contacted the interviewees and led the interview discussions. And then together we input the data into an ArcGIS survey 123. So we interviewed 15 people over our 12-week season, including carvers, weavers, city employees, Forest Service employees, tribal employees, and local mill owners and cultural leaders. And so in this first big picture, you can see the kids are interviewing, her name is Sonia Johnson. She's a weaver in Washington, and she has some nice, it was really cool for the kids too, because they could see the kind of work that they did. Like these are yellow cedar baskets. And then in the bottom right-hand photo, you can see Gordon Greenwald as a carver, and he was working on a totem pole last summer for the city. And so our conclusions from this research was basically there is not much communication currently between the Forest Service and artisans, and access to wood products like cedar bark and spruce roots is getting more challenging because you have to go further out the road. A lot of locals don't even have vehicles to get out the road, and it's just harder to find now. And also, wood products for cultural and heritage activities are crucial to Alaska Native people because it gives them purpose, it's used as a healing practice, and it's a pretty primary source of income, especially with our tourism season in the summer. We actually got to publish this research in the journal Forests this year too, which was pretty great. And in this top left-hand corner, you can see one of our crew members, Ted, this is when we were practicing form line drawing with our carver Gordon, and we got to help, get to see all of the work that they do. In this bottom left-hand corner is a chill cap blanket woven with cedar bark as well. And so the next aspect I wanted to talk about was environmental restoration, specifically trail maintenance. Our primary partner was Marlene Duval, and she's the natural resource specialist here in Hoonah at the Forest Service. And so the Forest Service actually is one of our biggest partners. We spend about 3 to 4 weeks with them in a lot of different ways, but one of which is trail maintenance. And so we helped them with, I think, about 5 or 6 different trails around Hoonah. So we lopped overgrowth, we removed the obnoxious plants like devil's club and cow parsnip, maintained the pathways by filling holes and restoring boardwalks, and we looked for potential issues such as like trees overhanging the trails that could be a threat later down the road. And so we helped collect this information for future trail development on Spaskai Trail specifically as well. This trail is it's a common one for hunters in Hoonah, and so the information that we were collecting for the trail development included like taking bridge measurements for bridge installations later down the road. And we had to help prepare for an environmental impact assessment by identifying salmon species present in the creeks nearby as well. So that was a really cool experience. And we also got a pretty close bear encounter too, which was exciting to say the least. And then with community service, we did a traditional food distribution. And so our primary partner here was Amelia Wilson. She's the executive director of the Hoonah Heritage Foundation, or HHF. HHF is a nonprofit in Hoonah dedicated to preserving and stewarding traditional Tlingit culture. And so with them, we harvested 6 traditional or wild foods throughout the summer: spruce tips, beach asparagus, fireweed, blueberries, fish like halibut and salmon, and Hudson Bay tea. So throughout our 12 weeks, we had several processing and harvesting days, very, very busy days out in the kitchen, cooking nonstop. We pickled beach asparagus. We made jams out of the blueberries and our fireweed flowers. We jarred the salmon and halibut, and we made syrup out of the spruce tips too. And it was really awesome as well because the youth got to help the Hoonah Heritage Foundation make these harvesting and processing videos that they put on Facebook and on their website, and for anybody in the community to go to, and if they needed help with a recipe or instructions on how to do these things. And throughout the summer, we actually ended up with over 300 jars and distributed them to over 100 people in the community, specifically tribal elders and community members. And we were going to have a traditional food fair, which is a community event that we've had for 2 years in a row, but because of COVID, we had to switch to, we did adapt, and we just did a distribution instead, which was a good alternative. But unfortunately, we weren't able to share more of our work with the community, which we would have done at the food fair. And lastly, when we're looking at data collection for natural resource monitoring, I decided to zoom in on our tree coring and dendrochronology project. Greg Wiles at the College of Worcester is the Environmental Studies Department Chair and Professor, and Ben Gagliotti is the professor at University of Fairbanks, and they are our primary partners for this project. And so if you're not familiar with the term, dendrochronology is studying past climatic conditions through tree cores. And so one tree ring grows per year. So through that, we can assign calendar dates to each ring. And the thickness of the ring indicates the environmental conditions at the time. For example, lower precipitation equates to thinner rings and also slower growth. And so Greg and Ben, they work all throughout Ohio and Alaska and different parts of the United States. In Alaska, they looked at a lot at glacial retreat and how the glaciers affected tree growth in the past. And so we were helping them cross-date the samples by collecting these tree core data on Chichagof Island, which is a bit further south, as you might know. And so we can use this research to predict how trees will grow with changing climatic conditions. And as we already talked about as well, cedar has relatively shallow roots, and so they're more sensitive to temperatures. So when there's less snow insulating the roots, they are less successful at growing to their fullest potential. And so this project was really fun because not only are we outside, getting to do like fun field work, but also it was cool because Ben and Greg allowed us to kind of design our own research study. So I asked the students what they were most interested in learning about. And so they decided to look at tree growth along elevation changes. And as well as looking at, we collected tree core data from all around Hoonah and out the road system. So we were looking for older roots in specific, or older trees in specific, and those ones have more exposed roots, sparse foliage in their crowns, and heavy and drooping lower limbs. The data we collected included their DBH measurements, diameter at breast height, GPS location, the species of tree, environmental conditions, and noticeable observations of the tree itself. So using the borer, we extracted these thin tree cores and we placed them in labeled straws and sent them to Greg in Ohio for him and his students to analyze the data. And we found that in this middle picture, you can see counterintuitively, the oldest trees were actually smallest in diameter on average. Our oldest tree was a shore pine dating back to 1594, which was 426 years old, so a pretty old tree. And along our elevation gradient study, we found that at higher elevations, so around 14,000 feet and higher, the older trees were larger in diameter, and at lower elevations, less than 1,000 feet, the older trees were actually smaller in diameter. So it was also interesting to see that shift as we went up in elevation. So some things that worked well, having many partners allowed for many perspectives throughout the summer. This was a big goal of ours because we like to include interdisciplinary projects so that when there are some students that are more interested in the, maybe shellfish and the water sampling and paralytic shellfish poisoning, we can allow them to expand their interests and knowledge in that area. But then also if there are students that are not interested in that and more interested in maybe, doing field work and trail maintenance and, maybe like the tree clearing and thinning sides of it, we could also do that as well. And also the many partners also allowed us to get them new career fields. many of the students didn't even know that these were potential career options. So we're just exposing them to different pathways for them to go down to. And it also allowed for them to have different skill development areas, like their interpersonal skill development through the interviews that we did, and then data collection through many different projects, as well as a lot of different like personal growth areas as well. We also found that building relationships with the students in the school was a really crucial aspect into letting the Trails program flourish as it did last year. My work as a Vista in the winter beforehand was really useful because they got to know my face a bit more. I helped create lessons and kind of engage them in scientific like ecosystem services and socio-ecological systems, like fields and activities already. So they were kind of familiar with what I do and what we're interested in and what we're talking about. And so when I was the Trails coordinator, it was, I think, more comfortable for them because they already knew me and my face. And then as well as I'm also, like Brian mentioned, I'm coordinating a fisheries technology course in the school this year. And so many students have already been coming up to me, and because again, I'm in the school more often and building those relationships with them, they are excited to apply to the Trails program because they're familiar with who I am. And then also prioritizing the youth's health and safety. And I don't necessarily mean their physical health and safety, although that's very important too, obviously. But really what I'm referring to is how they're mentally and emotionally doing. A lot of kids here in Hoonah, I mean, they might have problems in the home, or if they're just not doing okay in general, then they're not going to be able to reach their full potential here at work. And so I always tried to prioritize making sure that they were doing okay, just with life in general, before making sure we got all of our work done on time. And, you know, obviously getting all of our work done is extremely important, and we want to be able to do all of that, but I think people over what we're doing was a good thing to prioritize, and it showed them that we really care about how they're doing and not just getting the work done. And then lastly, the sense of purpose. In the beginning, it was, I think, difficult for the students to see like why we're doing this and why it matters and everything. But after going through the introductions with all of our project partners, starting to get to understand the work and what it is that we're doing, we started to relate it back to our lives in Hoonah and to the things that the youth here in Hoonah care about. And so that they care about going outdoors, they care about seeing whales, they care about, you know, having traditional foods that their family rely on, like salmon and halibut. And so when we're doing all of these different projects and monitoring these different natural resources, they can start to understand, like, these are the little nitty-gritty details that we have to go through to make sure that we still have these things that we care about. And what didn't work well, obviously COVID, but we were able to adapt pretty well because the city of Hoonah actually has a COVID wastewater treatment and sampling protocol. So we were able to monitor throughout the summer through the wastewater that there was no COVID all summer long, which allowed us to have a season. But if COVID were present in Hoonah, we wouldn't have been able to do that, which unfortunately last year, a lot of other normal trails communities weren't able to have a trail season. So I guess it's an advantage to be on an island during a pandemic, is what I learned. Also, member retention. We started off the season with 4 crew members, but we ended with 2. I mean, and life happens, so it wasn't really anybody's fault in particular, but that was one challenge that we faced as well. Something in the past that I've experienced as well was having unrealistic expectations for our youth. And by that, I mean expecting the teenagers to push themselves without external support and motivation, right? Like expecting them to just constantly be pushing themselves out of their comfort zone. Oftentimes I had to be the one to, you know, continue to ask them questions and make sure that they were really challenging themselves to get the work done and to just have personal growth. Also, assuming the youth know about the scientific language and protocols and career-specific information and data collection methods as well. A lot of the time, this is their first time doing this, so it's beneficial to start at their level after gauging what their level of experience is and walking them through up to where we need to be. And also having appropriate gear. A lot of youth, like one student in particular, he would never pack a real lunch, or you know, they don't have the field work gear that we need for going out the road and doing our work. So it was just, I had to constantly remind them that it was a work day and that they needed to be completely prepared. And then lastly, consistent funding is always a struggle. We're fighting for grants, you know, every year and stuff. So that's just something that I think is inherent in our work and what we're doing. And so moving forward, with Trails 2021 season is looking good. We have some of the same projects that we did last year and incorporating new ones, including entomology studies with the United States Forest Service in Juneau, as well as carbon assessments with Brian and Terra Verde, which I'm excited about. We are going to be doing more consistent work in the school, hopefully creating a natural resource management club this fall, as well as incorporating more UAS dual enrollment college courses in the high school as well to get them on track for these types of fields. We're always looking for new opportunities for youth after trails and after high school. So new jobs, internships, or other opportunities for them to continue working in natural resource management fields and developing their interests. And also, again, always looking for more reliable funding sources and opportunities too. Cool, that's everything I had for you guys today. So thank you for having me. And if you guys have any questions, I would love to answer them.
Thanks, Ariana. Wonderful talk. And you have the most amazing pictures of people doing things outside. I am really impressed. Do you take all those pictures yourself?
Yeah, I feel bad a lot of the time because like the kids are doing work and I'm like just trying to take pictures. And honestly, that's one of the hardest part about making the presentation is just I've almost too many pictures to choose from.
That's a good problem to have. You have wonderful images. Anybody that has questions for Ariana, please type them in the chat or use the hand raise function on your Zoom link. I'll remind everybody, if you want to earn continuing education credits, go ahead and put your name and SAF number in the chat box. Just as a reminder, you can only earn credits one day at a time. So at the end of each day's session, please put your CF number in the chat box. And if you can, I think it'd be easier if we saved that till the very end of the session to leave room for questions. Ken, go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned that your program was aimed at folks between the ages of 15 and 25, at least that's what I understood. And you also mentioned that you started with 4, ended up with 2. What was the age range? Were they high school students that stayed with you, or?
Yeah, great question. So we had 2 14-year-olds, or wait, no, sorry, 1 14-year-old, 1 15-year-old. We made an exception for the 14-year-old because he was turning 15 later in the summer. So they were high school students. And then the other 2 crew members that we had were both 19, so post-high school. And one of each, 1 high school student and 1 recent high school grad stayed on.
Was it mainly, well, I've dealt with that age range before, and sometimes, like you suggested, it's difficult to maintain interest, and they've got all sorts of stuff going on. And I was wondering
Right.
where the main things were that kind of eroded your group.
Right. Yeah. Well, one of our students, the recent high school grad that left, she actually got another job in Juneau. So she told me partway through the season, about halfway, that she was thinking about going to this job, but it really aligns with her interests and her professional opportunities. So she decided to take it, which I was happy for her because obviously I want what's best for her. And then the other student, the high school student, he didn't really have a choice. His family decided to move last minute, and so it was the last day of our training week, the first week of the program, and he told me that his family was moving and that he wouldn't be showing up for the rest of the season. And I was shocked, like, oh my gosh, but again, nothing we could really do about it. And we were thinking about we wanted to hire more crew members on, but to replace them, but I was just so busy out in the field every day, and there were other people that helped with the program here at HIA Environmental are also very busy with field work, so we just didn't really have the capacity to do the hiring process again.
Thanks. I see that Chris has a question.
Yeah, Ariana, that was awesome. I'm curious if you've ever seen or heard of the Foxfire books, where kids in Appalachia are interviewing their grandparents and writing up traditional practices they used in Appalachia. I know a couple tribal folks here have explored that a bit.
Nice. I don't think I have ever heard of it. You said it was called Foxfire?
Foxfire. It's a series of books. There's a few guys in this group here that are old enough to remember them, I think. But I suspect you'd probably go online and find them as used books. But I want to say they produced like 6 or 7 of them, and everything from how to tan a hide using brains and ashes, and how to build a whiskey still, which I'm not necessarily recommending. but the idea of kids formally engaging their grandparents to learn about their practices, that it's golden for both generations.
Awesome. Good to know. Thank you. Maybe I can find some funding available and we can purchase those and have like story time this summer.
Great. I see Ed has a question for you in the chat here, Ariana. He asks if it's competitive to get into your programs, or if you end up accepting most of the applicants.
Well, great question. I'd say it depends on the year. 2 years ago, back when I was here as an AmeriCorps Vista, and I was just like witnessing the trails program, but not coordinating it, we accepted, there was only 3 applicants and all 3 of them got hired. Then last year, so we have here in Juneau, we have the Icy Strait Point, which is a like cruise ship dock, tourism here in the summer, like a lot of places in Southeast. And so without an ISP hires a lot of people in town and youth as well. So without ISP, we had a lot more applicants this last year, and so it did make it a lot more competitive. We, depending on the year too, funding wise, we can hire more or less students. But we try to hire the students that are genuinely interested and want to continue career pathways down the, in natural resource management fields, and that also don't have already a lot of experience in doing them. So it's not really it's not a prerequisite to have X amount of years or skills in natural resource management and monitoring. We really wanted to use this program as an introduction for kids to get into these pathways.
Wonderful. Well, Ariana, I can't thank you enough for joining us today and sharing you've been doing in Hoonah and all the neat work you've been doing with the youth over there. And please, good luck this season and continue the good work you're doing. I'm going to turn it over to Ed for closing remarks. If you haven't entered your CF name and number yet, I'll be staying on here. Keep it open till about 1:30 if you want to stay on to do that, or join me to complain about the weather.
All right. Well, thanks, Brian. And Ariana, while you're still on the call, I want to thank you again for being here. And I'm always excited to hear about youth programs. My niece is currently in the Montana Conservation Corps, and she's getting just this wealth of experience, which it sounds like your kids are too. So really, really wonderful that you're doing that and helping the kids and the community. So thank you.
Thank you.
And it looks like Dave already took off, but it's a good reminder, as a forester, when I walk through the woods, I'm usually looking up, and it's a good reminder to look down and think about what's under my feet, and that it is determining what is above the ground. And Brian, just one comment on your introduction. You were talking about all the mine shafts and underground tunnels around Juneau. About 30 years ago, I worked in Hoonah, and one of my coworkers was a native Juneauite. And one weekend, he took us on this unofficial tour of some of the tunnels, because he had grown up here kind of exploring them. And we wandered through these shafts. Probably wasn't really safe, but what the heck, we were young and invincible. And we wandered through these shafts for half a day, went in at ground level, and then we popped out this one shaft, and we were like 1,000 feet above the valley floor. And it was pretty fun, but it was pretty amazing that all that mining is just honeycombed. Mountains are just honeycombed here. So thanks for reminding me of that little bit of history. Well, tomorrow we're going to move north again to the Cook Inlet chapter, and it looks like the topics will mainly be about forest health, insects, and diseases. So I look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow, and we will hope for better weather, at least in Southeast Alaska. I think we're going to get it, but we'll be here tomorrow, and I look forward to seeing everyone. Have a good afternoon.